Okay, so for the sake of this recording, this is Music Theory Boot Camp, and it is July 8th, 2022. So we are looking at our very first week here. So we're starting with notation, basic notation, right? And this is going to go super quickly. So if this is something that you're really pretty comfortable with, don't worry, you're going to have plenty of time to panic later. Let me see if I can share this here just so that we can talk about it. So there are a couple of different things this week. First thing is pitch. Second thing is basically rhythm or meter. And then there are a couple of new items that I added this year that were actually Nearpod activities, and we can go through those as well if you want. But they're just kind of a different perspective, right? A different way to explain the same material that is in here. And so it helps to kind of have that sometimes. So what you see in front of you is our worksheet, right? And I've found over the years that this is actually a good way to just go ahead and jump right in, because a lot of us, especially by the time we get to middle school and beyond, we pretty much know how to read the different staffs and different clefs. The one on the bottom of your screen might be a bit of a question mark. And so that's where we get stuck sometimes. So this worksheet, just to kind of recap the unit and then give you a couple specifics on the worksheet. The unit is mostly identifying pitch, right? And at least the first part of the unit, all identifying pitch. So we're looking at, basically counting lines and spaces, making sure that we've got the right letter names down. So I don't have my stylus with me today, which is a real bummer, but let me see if I can notate a little. I can draw footballs, I'm sure. There. So this is just to check your work. This is B, right? Because the spaces on the treble clef staff spell face, F-A-C-E. And then the lines are everything around face, right? So E, G, B, D, and F. And so that's all we're doing when we have ledger lines, is we're kind of extending that pattern. Okay. So this happens to be a B. This is a D. This is a G. Okay. This one's a D below. This is a B. So how are we doing so far? Does this look like, we've kind of gotten most of these just based on the lines and spaces?
Yeah.
Okay. So now what they're asking for with the ASA convention here, oopsie, I have to move my picture and I can't do that when I'm writing. There we go. They're talking about basically the octaves on a piano. Okay. So the ASA convention is where you're taking the, like, for example, they have C4, right? If you look at middle C on a piano, and you count all the C's up from the bottom of the keyboard, and you're looking at the first C, that's C1, and then C2 is the next octave up, C3, middle C is C4. Okay. Now that's really useful if you're a pianist. If you're not a pianist, it might not be as useful. So I'm a flutist by trade. Okay. And I like when I'm writing in my notebooks, for my students, I almost always use our little naming convention, which does the exact same thing, but it goes from the bottom of our range up to the top of our range. So C4 for us is like, 8 ledger lines up, because that's the fourth C that we have, in the flute range. This B down here for flute would be B1. Oops, can't draw anymore. There we go. Right. This would be D3, et cetera, et cetera. This would be D1. Okay, so I'm not so concerned with the ASA convention. So if that confused you, don't worry about that too much. Just know that's basically a pianist thing. That's a keyboard thing. It's totally fine if you play another instrument to kind of use whatever convention you're accustomed to whenever you're talking amongst other instrumentalists of the like kind. Okay. Which is totally fine. The keyboard convention is also not used as frequently when you're talking about mixed instruments. Okay. So if you're in band, since you're in band and play percussion, you might hear the band director talk about different octaves to different instrument sections, but they might not say anything about keyboard conventions because there are no keyboardists in band, right? So I'm not necessarily as worried about that part, but you should hopefully be able to identify, look, this is, this letter name and this is this letter name. Okay. So now the other two clefs, bass clef, unless you play a bass instrument, so unless you are, a tuba euphonium player or a cellist or bassoon, something like that, then you may not, or a keyboardist, you may not be as familiar with the bass clef because it seems to be there are just a ton of instruments that play in treble clef, even if they're transposing instruments, including guitar. So the bass clef has a slightly different setup, right? Let's look at the treble clef just for a second. The treble clef shape, this little loopy, okay, that little loop, that little hook comes on the G. I don't know if I could draw it there. There, that comes on the G line. So a lot of times the treble clef we call the G clef. And so there are actually older pieces of music, French music, in fact, from the 18th century and earlier that use something called French violin clef. And they take that treble clef and they just move it down a little bit. And so the G is on the bottom line instead of that second to bottom line. And so it does move around. And so for that reason, we don't always refer to it, or you might see it additionally referred to besides the treble clef as the G clef. So that is just one of those, you might see it in the textbook here or there that it's the G clef instead of the treble clef. One other thing that does also happen, you can occasionally find this under the treble clef. That means that that clef is sounding an octave lower than what is written. It's just another variation. It's not anything really, going to change the labeling system. It's, again, just something to watch out for. You might see it in music eventually. Okay. With the bass clef, so where the treble clef is a G clef, okay, the bass clef is what we call the F clef. And that's because the two little dots around our bass clef hook encompass and encircle the F line. Okay, so that means that our lines are G, B, D, F, A. Good boys do fine always. Okay. And the spaces are A, C, E, G. All cows eat grass. Now, if this feels like, oh, how am I ever going to remember this? Just remember that music theory, like any other aspect of music, is skills-based. So it's all about practice. Okay, that's why every part of the different modules has an entire page devoted just to practice. Here are different websites to use and different programs and different videos and different worksheets, because that's just how we get better. Using it a lot, it's like learning a language. Using it a lot means you're going to remember it more. So the bass clef, F clef, and we can do exactly like we did with the treble clef. So the bottom line is G, top line is A. This little thing in here is C. And then if we count up, this one's E. Use those ledger lines, okay? So how is the bass clef feeling? Does that make sense? Should we practice more of the bass clef?
I used to play the piano, so I remember the bass clef a little bit, and I also played the bass guitar a little bit. But besides that, I don't really remember the bass clef a lot.
It's good to know. Yeah, and it's just like treble clef.
Yeah, I remember the bass clef is just like treble clef, except every note is moved down by two.
Exactly. It's off by a third. is basically how we say it. And yeah, we're going to learn intervals next week. So don't worry, you're getting there. But yeah, that's it. Now for the purposes of this class, we are going to get to use both clefs together in something we call a grand staff. So essentially you're going to have kind of this type of thing. I don't know who's running the vacuum cleaner out there. Sorry. Anyway, you're going to see like a bracket, right? Where both clefs are together like you would in keyboard writing and piano writing. And so you will get an opportunity to use bass clef a little bit. And again, it's one of those things, just think about the more you practice it, the easier it gets. So for the purposes of this class for the next couple of weeks, until we get to that point where we're using 4 voices on a staff, it might be easier to think of some of the shapes and intervals and scales and things like that in treble clef, just because you're a little more fluent with it right now. But either is fine, and we will eventually use both. So let's look at this third clef down here. This is an interesting clef. This is called the movable C clef. Okay. And the movable C clef is something that, we see frequently in certain instrument writing and then never in others. And the instrument that uses this particular clef is viola. Okay. And the position of the clef, where the little bubble, right, it looks like a B, the little bubble kind of comes around that center line, that is the alto clef. Okay. Now, this is a story I tell for every theory class. So anybody that has taken any of my other classes has probably heard it, but I think of this as the Becky clef. And it's because my very first year teaching, I was teaching AP music theory, and I had a violist in my class whose name was Becky. And I drew this clef up on the board and went through the whole, talk. And I said, how are you going to, remember the lines and spaces or whatever on this clef? And she raised her hand. She said, this one's the Becky clef. What do you mean? And she said, it's because it looks like a B. So there's the line, and then you got the bubble, and then the other bubble. And so it's the Becky clef. So if that helps you remember, you could totally use it. But this clef, because remember I said it's called the movable C clef, this can move around. So the little Becky part, right, the little bubble can actually go up. All right. And if it comes right there on that second to top line, that's the tenor clef. So we start with the alto on the line or on the staff. We shift it up, it's the tenor clef. And then you can also go all the way down to the bottom line, like that. And that is the soprano clef. Okay. Now you probably noticed those words, alto, tenor, soprano, they relate to the different voice parts that we have. And so the whole point of this clef being movable is that the range of those parts can be situated in such a way on the staff that you're not using too many ledger lines. So when you have a very low sitting clef like that soprano clef, sopranos sing pretty high, right? And so the rest of those notes that would otherwise be ledger lines up on the treble clef, they kind of get put down on the staff. And so it eliminates this need for ledger lines. I should also say that the part where the B comes together, that is middle C. So if we're looking at middle C in some of our other staves, okay, let me write it over here. You probably know this one already, right? Middle C on treble clef is 1 ledger line below the staff. And middle C in bass clef is 1 ledger line above the staff. So here's the really interesting part about this clef is that if the part that the B comes together, those little bumps come together on the middle C, and both of these notes are middle C, the way that this clef actually kind of finds its way into the grand staff is right in between these two clefs. Okay, so kind of like that. And we've got a middle C in here. This is spaced really strangely, but that would be our middle C. And so that is sort of the range that altos, the violas play in, is kind of right in between the treble and the bass clefs. So that's a little background on bass clef, or sorry, on alto clef. and movable C clefs in general. Let me erase a little of this because it looks very confusing here. And let's just identify these. Now, you might have already come up with some ways to identify these pitches, you know, when you were kind of going through the practice. A lot of people will just say, okay, this is C in the middle, and then count, you know, above and below. I like to look at it in relation to what I already know, which is treble clef. And so if I'm looking at this, I'm reading the notes one step down from where they would be in treble clef. So this is a B. This is an A. This is a D. This is an E. This is a D. You get the gist of that. Okay. Now these clefs, the C clefs, they're good to know. They're good to, you know, understand so that you can decipher them if you ever needed to. They're good to be able to write them because you might have to write them at some point. You know, especially if you take another theory class that lasts longer than 4 weeks. But for our purposes, it's good to know that it exists. Again, you want to practice it a little bit, but for the most part, we're going to be working in treble and bass clefs. So, any questions about notation, like finding the notes on the staff?
No.
No, good. Okay, there was one other thing, and I don't know if I can share it or not. Let me see if I can scoot over to that page. Oh, maybe I can. Hold on one sec. Oh, Zoom. Okay. There we go. Let's see if I can find. Oh, all right. Let me clear this out. So there was a Nearpod that was in the course. Let me see if I can. There. And it talked about melody. And one of the things that was really useful, let me see if I can find it in here, was about solfege. I don't know if you guys saw that or not. Oh boy, this is a really long one. Well, that's super long. Okay. I'll tell you what, let's go back. I won't go through the whole thing because it's going to take a long time. But there were a couple of things in this kind of overview, okay, that were important. One was the difference between conjunct and disjunct melody. Those are two really nice words to be able to use, and I can kind of write right on their staff here. So conjunct is when you have notes that are stepwise. Your little footballs are just going line space, line space, line space, line space, right? The whole way up or down. Ascending would be going up, descending would be going down. Conjunct is obviously connected, right? So it's a good way to remember that. Disjunct would be leaps. So disjunct is disconnected. Okay. And so that would be kind of up and down leaps all over the place. Again, you can go ascending or descending. If you have the leap of a third, okay, which is basically space to space, that's still considered disjunct, okay, technically speaking. So again, not like this makes or breaks your, part writing assignments or anything, but it's good to know when you have something that's conjunct that is connected, and then disjunct, which is kind of leapy all over the place. The other thing that was important in this little video is the solfege aspect. So I don't know, sometimes we do solfege in, elementary school, if you have a teacher who is very into that. Sometimes we just learn it as kids, otherwise, not necessarily in a music class. Sometimes people just really like the sound of music and you learn solfege that way. We will cover this a little bit more in depth when we talk about scales, which is next week. So it's worth kind of, just preemptively sort of knowing about it. But let's just say we had a G major scale on here. Okay, so G, A, B, C, D, E, F, F sharp, and G. Okay. So this, of course, would be in the key signature, but that's okay. We're going to stick it on the staff. As you go up the scale, we can assign solfege names, okay, to each of these notes. So our tonic is do, and then re is supertonic. Mi, these probably sound familiar, I would imagine. Fa is the fourth syllable. Fa. Sol is actually 3 letters, S-O-L. Sol, la, most common one. T is our leading tone, which means it's a half step from the tonic, and then do. Right? So again, not something we need to be fluent in right this minute. It's really nice to have this as we start doing more ear training. Okay. And looking at the scales and the differences in the scales next week. So when we're doing major versus minor versus modes versus octatonic and chromatic, and all these different kinds of scales, it's good to know. And it's also good to know them for the sake of intervals, because intervals are the distances between any of these notes. So we're going to do like, what's the interval between do and mi? Well, we have 3 letter names or 3 solfege syllables, do, re, mi, or G, A, B. That's the interval of a third. Okay, so it comes in handy to be able to talk about the pitches that way. Okay, so the other half of this module is actually on, let me get my pointer back out here, is actually on rhythm, which as a percussionist, you're probably all over, right?
Yeah.
Let's see here. Did you have any questions about the rhythm unit?
No.
Pretty simple stuff, right? So we basically have simple meters and compound meters. Simple meters are anything that is a meter divisible by 2. And what I mean by divisible by 2 is the microbeat versus the macrobeat. So basically you're taking the pulse and giving it a division of 2 8 notes, right? So any of these meters that are simple are going to be 2/4, 3/4, 4/4. What were some other ones? 2/2, common time, cut time, those kinds of things. They're all simple meters. And then compound meters have a division, a microbeat of 3. So 6/8, 9/8, 12/8, 6/4. Most of the time is considered compound. 3/2 is considered simple. Okay, so it always depends on how you're subdividing the big pulse. Okay, if you have a dotted pulse, it's going to be a compound meter. If you have just a regular quarter note or half note, it's going to be a simple meter. And then on top of that, you have 3 designations in your groupings. So the subdivision that we're talking about between simple and compound, I keep saying microbeat. The macrobeat is what determines your other designation, which is going to be duple, triple, or quadruple. Okay, meaning you've got 2 beats in a measure, that's duple. You've got 3 beats in a measure is triple, and you've got 4 beats in a measure, and that's quadruple. So 12/8 is quadruple compound. Okay, 2/2 or 2/4 are both simple duple. Okay, so you always have to have both. You have to know what the macrobeat is and what the microbeat is. Okay, and that's where we get these labels, right? Another thing that oftentimes people get confused on is, the fraction, right? Meters are not actually a fraction. They're just, again, it's just a notation kind of designation to make sure we have all the information as a performer. So the top number is how many beats you get in a measure. And the bottom number is the quality or the beat type that you're looking for in each measure. Okay. So in this case, we're getting 2 half notes in a bar, right? This also kind of gives you a clue sometimes as far as tempo goes. Usually 2-2 is on the quicker side because you're not going to, you're going to feel a 2 beat rather than counting it in 4 quarter notes. Right. And so the pulse has to kind of have a certain momentum in order to count 2. So sometimes it gives you a clue there too. The worksheet for this, just to kind of quickly go over that, and I'll erase these. There we go. The worksheet here was to give the meter signature. So which meter did we give to number 1? Tricky. And it's especially tricky because we have something here called an anacrusis, which is this thing. In other words, it's a pickup note.
Okay.
Yeah. So don't count that one. Just go ahead and look at this middle measure or the next one. These are all kind of grouped in a way. Would it be a compound or a simple meter?
Compounds.
Compound meter. Good. Okay, so we have a couple of options with compound meters. With compound meter, we always list the microbeat as the bottom number. So what seems to be our subdivision? Quarters, eighths, halves?
It looks like those are eighth notes.
Eighth notes. Okay, so our bottom number is going to be an 8. And how many eighth notes do we have in a measure?
8.
Close. Count carefully. That's why this is compound.
But wait, in that measure or just in a regular measure?
Well, and this is another kind of trick question that gets us tripped up here a little bit. If I'm counting that second measure, it looks like there's only 3, right? But what we're counting when we're talking about meter is in the course of any given measure, how many eighth notes are possible. So in any of these measures, there's actually 6 eighth notes, right? So we have 1, 2, 3, and then that second beat, that's a dotted quarter, we have another 3, right? So like that. So this is actually 6/8. It is a compound duple meter. And it is, like I said, it has an anacrusis. Okay. So this is a pickup note. The downbeat is called the crucis. And then the stuff in between is called the metacrusis. And then we have another anacrusis, a crucis, and a metacrusis. Okay. They're all Greek words that talk about where the beat is. So yeah, 6/8 in that one. That's how we decide that. The second one looks similar, but the macro beat is a little bit different. We don't have dotted notes anymore. We've got just regular quarters. See how
I think from looking at the second to last measure, it looks like it's 3/4.
You got it. Yeah, exactly. 3/4. Because we're looking at the quarter note, right? And that's where that bottom number comes from. We've got 3 quarter notes in a measure. There you have it. Okay, so that's a simple triple. This next one, number 3, is really tricky.
From the second measure, it's 3/2.
Correct. Yes. I think it's 3/2 and not 6/4. And that's the thing. This first measure looks like it could almost be 6/4. Remember, I said 6/4 is compound. And so the dotted half is usually what we get as the beat or the macro beat. But I agree, this looks like 3/2. This actually looks like 3/2. It could be either, but I think that's 3/2. And then the last measure for sure is 3/2. So I think 3/2. How about number 4? Because that is a little bit trickier.
5. No. Is this one 4/4?
Close. There is a 4. I do think the bottom number is 4. How many quarter notes do we have in a beat though? Or sorry, in a measure, not a beat.
Is it 5/4?
Close. Keep counting. Check out this measure right here. This third one.
Yeah, I've been looking at that one.
And we're counting the rest, you know, as a beat too. So we actually have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because that's our half. 6.
6.
Exactly. Yeah. So 6/4, and that is a duple, a compound duple. Right. And then in this measure right here kind of tells it all, right? That's where we differentiate these two meters. All right. So meter identification and hopefully the note identification, you know, they're essential for reading music and learning about music. It's just that these are some of the most kind of black and white, you know, subject material that we talk about. So so if you feel like you need a little bit more practice, you know, feel free to send me an email. There's lots of practice to be had on musictheory.net. That's a really good resource. There's also a site called Theoria, which I can walk you through, and that's a really great program too. It's just for continual, again, skill-based, you know, practice. So that's the way we kind of get ourselves organized around this. Do you have any other questions for me about notation or rhythm or solfege or what's coming next?
No.
I think it's going to be fine. Yeah. So let me just quickly show. Let me get a mouse out here. Oops, that was a theory syllabus from a different class. Okay. So let me just show you what's coming up next week. So here's what we did this week. Next week, we're talking about intervals and scales. Now, some people, learning intervals by themselves seems a little bit abstract. And then once they learn scales, it makes intervals easy. However, learning scales first, you at least need to know whole step, half step to be able to build a scale. So my advice for next week, I'm going to lay it out just like I have here, where we're doing the intervals Monday, you know, for notes, practice on Tuesday, scale notes on Wednesday, practice on Thursday, and then we meet on Friday. But if there is a, you know, like a little bit of a roadblock that you have with intervals, skip it and go to scales, and then come back to intervals at the, you know, later in the week, and we'll kind of wrap it all together on Friday. It's I mean, when I teach AP music theory, I actually teach whole step, half step by themselves, teach scales, and then teach the rest of the intervals, because it's very it's tricky to do one before the other completely. So that's my advice with week number 2. If intervals feel a little funny, let it go to scales. And we're usually more familiar with scales anyway as instrumentalists because we practice them, right? So go to scales. And then when you feel like the scales are kind of making sense to you, go back to the intervals and think about intervals in the context of scales. It usually makes better sense that way. So hopefully that'll be a fun ride starting Monday. So thanks for joining me today, Ronak, and everybody else who's going to join asynchronously. If you have any questions, as always, you know, feel free to send me a quick email. You can do it through Canvas. You could do it just external emails, fine. My phone number is in the Canvas course. You can always text me a question if that's easier. And I will see you all next Friday.
Okay.
Okay. Have a good week. Bye-bye.
Bye.